Can your state legislature overrule the voters and just pick the electors? Now, I know some of you are watching this in the news, but it's performative here, but let's go over it. Each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors. Do the Constitution in each state and on a federal level allow a state legislature to directly choose a slate of electors without a popular vote? Can your legislature, your politicians decide who won an election? Yes, I'm saying it that way. By assigning the state's electoral votes and overrule, in effect, any voter's decision, even in an emergency or when you claim it's been tampered with or any excuse, because this does not have an excuse function. Unless your state has fully altered its constitution, which would be big news. No. Traditionally, every state or any other subcategory in a representative government, and in fact in the United States, all the constitutions auto-assign the majority and or all of the electoral votes to the candidate with the most popular votes. Even in states that do a ranked system, it just ends up being majority-based. The idea is, in the ranked system or in the list of preferred items, like which one do you hold the nose about least, it's still just the majority vote. More convoluted or not, what it does is it takes power away from your elected officials and everybody they appointed who might have an ability to affect anything about an election. Because that's sane. You don't want the king deciding or counting the votes. The 14th Amendment was written in the 1800s, 1866, and that sort of thing. Section 2 basically says the following. Now, I'm not going to go into details. I'm not going to read it verbatim. That's your cue to go look it up and see if I'm wrong. I found that works better. People don't double check me. They just say I'm wrong. Actually look it up. When the right of voting for a presidential elector, that's that one. Some of the states have it if you vote at all. And anyway, if your right to vote or have your vote counted in any way is denied to any or all voters in a state, then the basis of representation in such states must be reduced by the number of all of the voters. They immediately lose the same percentage in the old days of seats in the House as the percentage of people whose right to vote was taken away. If 10% of the voters were disenfranchised in your state to prevent them from having an effect on the election, and if you're not aware, in some states, for any election, then your ability as a state is reduced on a federal level. If a county is excluded, that county's effect on things has to be reduced by the same measure. Many states have this trickle down of the Constitution to where it applies to everything. You might want to look that up. Some of you out there claim to be constitutionalists, but you really don't like it when it gets in the way of what you want done. And I'm talking about both sides here. Someone tried to do this when Trump got elected. I'm not joking. In 1868, after the 14th was law and the second section was part of it, the legislature of Florida almost decided to choose a presidential elector slate without the popular election at all. They were trying to test it. They were advised, and you can look up the history of this, whether or not they really wanted to go through with it or not. Maybe, again, this is performative. This wasn't going to happen. People write about the fact that this would have the effect if someone wanted to push the way the law was interpretable to make it to where they had no votes. Basically, this was a check and balances against each state trying to affect a federal election. Now, again, you might be in a state where if there's a statewide election, but some county decides, oh, there's too many people I don't like voting, I'm going to disenfranchise them. that state is no longer counted. That part of the state is no longer counted. Well, that would be kind of a tactical move. You could, as a political party, if you were the ruling individuals controlling who counts the votes, decide not to count them. But almost every state decided, obviously, if my party can do that, so can the opposing party. That just means that they're sabotaging, if you're not aware of it, the other side exclusively. If the Democrats can sabotage a Republican county or district, or the Republicans can sabotage a Democrat county or district, they will. Why would you assume they wouldn't do it? We've seen this in our own time. Some of you might be old enough to remember decades ago somebody trying to do something like this. But the point is, this has happened recently. Okay, this is fresh in our memories. Nobody's forgetting this. And I don't care if you want to have an argument about it, you're aware of it. Even if you agreed with it, you know it can be used against you. It's in no one's best interest, when you're each holding a gun to each other's head, for anybody to get twitchy or take the safety off. And this is one of those things where it's mutually assured destruction. The reason we have a representative system in the first place is the representatives do our bidding, not that they vote for us. However, there is an exception. The reason that we have an electoral college, partially, is for fairness. A weird type of fairness that we use in this country. I don't like it. I think it's antiquated for a very specific reason only, but it's there because it was necessary at one time. At the time when votes were counted, the count of votes was a very slow thing to do originally. I mean, you could count votes and report in via telegraph, but you were required to physically send someone who was a representative for a certain number of thousands of people to cast the vote on their behalf because that was needed. Now it's not. And most states don't really even do that internally, but on a presidential election we do. And the reasoning being is the president represents all of our states. But now the president represents the majority of the people, and every state, virtually every state, has continually repeated that when they have an election, the people of the state are what have been counted, not the Electoral College. Every state has reaffirmed this, even though that's not what it says on paper. In effect, the way it's treated, because every time someone wants to use an Electoral College hack, it gets overruled by that state saying, but the majority voted this way. And they do an all or nothing where all of their they have two votes that are not controlled by the Electoral College. And then they have the Electoral College votes, their own little, individual votes per state. It's a small number to get it just kind of done. This was expedient. This is Pony Express stuff, right? Actually, not really Pony Express. That's a different era, but you get the idea. Well, that's not needed anymore. But many states, with a couple of exceptions, take all or nothing attitude. The state of Oregon had the opportunity to make it to where it was proportional. Unless all of the states use a proportional vote, it's actually better that we stay this way. That's what most people believe and agree with, and I can see both sides of it. I just don't believe on this one basic thing that we're now in the modern era and we don't literally have to have someone physically show up to cast our vote for us, because I don't trust our representatives anymore, because in case you didn't notice, in one or two elections, you might want to look up that second election, we had people yelling very loudly about not doing what they were told as our representatives. Being overruled by your representative isn't something I'm willing to tolerate. And yes, in some societies, they don't survive it. You're a representative till death do us part. Please understand that if you're in favor on one incident so you can get Trump in office, or in one incident making sure Hillary was president, you're willing to throw out the basic rights of everybody in the United States, I want you to leave my country, or at least acknowledge that you don't get that this will bite you on the ass. Bare minimum, do that. It's not a slippery slope, it's a cliff. Let's get on with this. Legislation passed in 2022 which was bipartisan, revised the federal law governing the selection of electors to specify that a state's legislature must determine their state's method of choosing electors before Election Day and can't change it after the votes are cast. Many states have rulings that say that there can be no changes to their election system, actually most of them do, after a certain date at all, because they know that politicians will look at polls and try to rig the election because they kept doing it. The state of Oregon has had these rules for a long time because lots of politicians apparently one time tried to do this. So as a backhanded maneuver, the only changes they made were you weren't allowed to make changes. Now, you may have noticed that politicians will sometimes sandbag or sabotage the next legislator because they don't want them to have any rights to do anything so that they can freeze up things and try to keep them from either A, making progress, or B, sabotaging all their work immediately after they're not in office. That way they don't have to worry about it. But you can do that per rule or law, saying this law has to be subject to an evaluation period where it's employed and is allowed to be tested through the legal system and through the courts and allow the judges to determine whether or not the rule goes through. In the state of Oregon, we, the people of the state of Oregon, passed 114, or whatever you want to call it. I would call it something much worse, where it was going to make a bunch of rules about how we did things in this state concerning firearms ownership. And a majority of the population just barely agreed with this. But it was literally almost a 50-50 split, and it went immediately to the courts because it was written so badly that it wasn't able to be implemented. The only reason we don't have these rules really being implemented, I mean, even the parts that were allowed to through are subject to court cases because they were so poorly written. That has nothing to do with partisan politics or anything. It has to do with, do you know how to write a law? Do you know how to be completely unambiguous? That's an example of something that is subject to a period of time that you would normally institute due to the fact that this has had less than a complete majority. It's not a supermajority, obviously, that this law should be treated as being provisional. A provisional law, which sounds contradictory, is sometimes done as a provisional decision. However, the ATF makes these kind of decisions where they say provisionally, we're going to enforce the law this way because we think that's the proper way to do it. Most of us would assume that it isn't because it is the ATF and they're a bunch of morons. So this allows for changes. You can change the manner in which you do this, but not the result. It has to be based on the majority of the votes in this state in some way. And you can't do it after Election Day. You can't change the way you're counting the votes once you find out that you're losing, okay? If all of a state's voters have their right to vote and it's taken away for some or all of them, because it has to affect everyone's rights, not just some, the 14th Amendment, Section 2, now requires that a state's House representation immediately and automatically be reduced to 0 for all of this, except for the 2 default ones they get, which makes it to where it has almost no effect. It would also not require, automatically, that you have this certain cutoff number either. That's also been thought of. It would have only 2 presidential electors, rendering its influence of the presidential election minuscule or irrelevant. And here's the next thing. It would have the effect of reducing their power through the next set of terms. Because they chose to disenfranchise their voters, the representatives have no merit. They would not be allowed to have equal voting power. The state would be basically cutting its legs off. Disenfranchisement depends on whether the people or the legislator chooses the electors. Not which elector is selected, not based on rules, it's based on the effect. Are the people making this decision or the legislature? This is a very firm stomping to death the idea that you can be overruled by your elected officials when they feel threatened by you voting against them and their wishes. That's the way it's supposed to be. Otherwise, well, let them eat cake. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with that.